Welcome to EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. I'm your host, Russ Roberts of George Mason University and Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Our website is econtalk.org, where you can subscribe, find other episodes, comment on this podcast, and find links and other information related to today's conversation. Our email address is mail@econtalk.org. We'd love to hear from you. Today's June 13th, 2012, and my guest is Jim Manzi. He is the author of Uncontrolled. Jim, welcome to EconTalk.
Glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Your book is a really extraordinary overview of the history of science, the current state of economics, social science generally, what we know and what we don't know, and what we might do about all that. And I want to start with a thumbnail sketch of the history of science, which you devote a couple chapters to. How did our knowledge begin to grow so dramatically? And why don't you start with Francis Bacon, as you do in the book?
Sure. I think he is obviously a seminal figure in the development of modern science, who is often referred to today, but not read as much as he ought to be. And one of the things I discovered as I really went back to some of his books that I hadn't seen since high school is how incredibly prophetic he was and how much he laid the philosophical foundations for modern empirical science. And I think the most foundational transformation that occurred because of his thinking was what he called the transition from wherefrom to whereby. And what he meant by that was abandoning the Aristotelian attempt to understand things like final or ultimate causes, and instead simply think of the world as particles plus rules for their interaction. He was very clear that the purpose of this and the purpose of science was not to attain philosophical truth, but ultimately to, in his words, or in translation in his words, to increase the limits of the power and greatness of man. In other words, for Francis Bacon, the ultimate purpose of science is not truth, it's improved engineering.
Is it useful?
Exactly. And he was clear, of course, that he called, it's crazy to get past this crazy language, even in translation, it's difficult, but once you do, you realize how modern he is. And he talks about the concept of experiments of fruit versus experiments of light. And by experiments of fruit, he means fundamentally experiments oriented around solving immediate practical problems, and experiments of light being research and analysis. He didn't really distinguish between experiments and observation as rigorously as we know how to do today, but research and analysis to determine general principles. And he was clear that the ultimate goal was improved engineering, that in fact it made a lot of sense to focus on experiments of light for a long period of time, not only on experiments of fruit, and saw actually a fluid relationship in his idea of applied, what we call today applied and basic research, and emphasized the need to do basic research and for scientists themselves to be motivated by a belief that they were seeking truth, whereas he saw the ultimate goal of the overall scientific endeavor ultimately as being practical progress.
And as you mentioned, we've been really good at that, at the practical side. I use a few obvious examples: MRI, airplanes, your cell phone, right? We've done an extraordinary job of mastering the physical world to produce useful tools. But we'd like more than that. And there, our understanding is more limited.
You mean applied to social and economic policy?
And the part that Bacon was going to put to the side about the truth. I think a lot of people have a romance about science and social science, that it seeks truth and it finds truth, and that experiments illuminate truth. But they're much better experiments in scientific knowledge generally. One of the themes I got from your book is they're much better at highlighting what works most of the time. They're not so good at discovering what works all the time, which is what truth would require. That's
right. And there are several points embedded in your question, and I spent a lot of time on this in the book because I think this is foundation you have to lay to really think rigorously about social sciences. And what he emphasizes, and what I think is true if you look at the actual modern practice of science, is science, like markets and other, and I argue analogous institutions, and I'm not the first to make this observation, creates progress as an emergent phenomenon that individual scientists typically feel like in some way they are participating in a process which is finding truth. One of the things I say in the book is the idea that scientific findings are literally only predictive tools and unrelated to the actual, quote unquote, really true structure of the universe is called instrumentalism. And there are literally zero successful scientists of my acquaintance who are themselves instrumentalists. However, the process of science is brutal about treating theories as predictive tools that are discarded when better predictive tools come along, and evaluating the truth in the scientific sense of that term of a statement as the ability to make reliable, non-obvious predictions. And therefore, I think this idea, as you say, of romanticizing science is a category error. The goal of science is not actually, in the strictest sense, finding truth in the classic philosophical definition of correspondence between statement and reality. The purpose of science is to build reliable, non-obvious predictive rules that allow us to master our physical environment better than we could in the absence of those rules. And I think clarity on that point is crucial when we start to consider social and social sciences, economics, and so on, because while distinctions that can be hyper-technical when dealing with pure physical science start to become very significant when we deal with social reality. And many of the inherent, implicit, and therefore unstated rules of thumb or heuristics used by the scientific method that are a tolerable approximation in something like classical physics start to come unglued when we apply those methods to more complicated phenomena like social structures.
And of course, the gold standard of scientific progress, which is the replicable experiment, is much tougher in the social sciences, both in terms of the ability to replicate as well as its generality. So you start off spending a reasonable amount of time doing something which seems like just philosophical theorizing that's not really important, which is Hume's problem with induction, which seems like a nitpick in certain applications, but is kind of central when you think about the social sciences.
That's right. I mean, I think that at the level of philosophy of science, Hume's problem of induction, which is essentially that if I conclude that a relationship is causal by observing that X is always preceded by Y, I cannot know for a fact that that relationship will hold in the future. So to take a seemingly nitpicking example or kind of crazy example, just because every time I've let go of a coin it's fallen doesn't mean that I know that if I let go of the quarter I'm now holding in my hand, it will fall. It might just sit still in the air. And Hume, in fact, made fun of himself. In fact, he jumped ahead of the reader who knew he was going to make fun of himself and sort of made fun of this and said, this might seem crazy, but actually I think it's somewhat important. And of course, it's crucially important at a philosophical level, even for physical science. But it becomes extremely important and practical when we deal with social sciences because the complexity of the phenomena under study makes it much less practically certain that when we observe a relationship and induce that it is a cause and effect relationship, that we can reliably generalize that to future instances and take action based upon it.
So let's talk about an example you mentioned in the book, which I think about all the time and write about way too much, and I think I've spoken about it a number of times on this program, which is the stimulus package of 2009, which was about $820 billion, is what it turned out to be after the fact. And there are a large number of economists who, quote, know that it created a certainly large number, millions of jobs. And I guess the relevant question would be, how do you know? And your answer...
My argument is...
Go ahead.
Yeah, my answer is you don't know. The only people I'm extremely skeptical of are people who insist they know the answer to that question. One of the reasons I started writing this book is I had started a software company at the very end of the 1990s. And anyone who's ever done a startup knows you go down into a very deep tunnel when you do that, and you are focused really only on your business. And I sold a portion of the company and kind of reemerged into the light just before the massive financial crisis occurred in 2008. And I remember, for the first time, in effect, looking at the TV in a long time and seeing, baritone-voiced, very serious-looking economists saying, we know what caused this crisis, and by the way, here's the proposal that will have a positive effect. And of course, 10 minutes later, you could see another very serious-sounding baritone-voiced economist saying exactly the opposite. Right? And watching this, I said, I've just spent 10 years trying to figure out how many Snickers bars ought to go on a shelf at the convenience store and what the effect of the change of adding more or fewer Snickers bars would be. And that's really difficult. And it's difficult because human beings are complicated. And it's extremely difficult to make predictions that are non-obvious, that are reliable and useful about the effect of our interventions. And I start from a position of extreme skepticism that you can really know something like this. And really, I spent several years diving into it. And as I think you've mentioned in at least one Wall Street Journal column that I've read, even at the time, and I started writing by around the time, so in early 2009, this debate is happening. You can see, Paul Krugman and Joseph Stiglitz and people with Nobel Prizes in economics arguing that we need a stimulus, and in fact, it ought to be much bigger than $20 billion. And at the exact same time, you can see James Buchanan, and Prescott, and Smith, and Gary Becker, and other people with Nobel Prizes in economics saying, this is a really bad idea. This is not a good use of money at all. And what I wrote in early 2009 is, I have an opinion on it. I don't pretend it's science about what we have to do. But I don't believe any of the folks who are making these confident assertions really know what the effect will be. And the only prediction I'll make is this, that I will predict that in early 2011, the professor of famous economist X said, unemployment will be about, X percent, say 10% in 2 years without this bill and 8% with the bill. When it gets to be 2011, if unemployment is 10%, here's what that professor is going to say. Conditions were worse than we thought they were. Yep. So without the bill, unemployment would have been 12%, not 10%. It's now 10%. So you see I was right all along. It lowered it by about 2 points.
Yep.
And, it's exactly what happened, of course. That's exactly what the administration economists came out and said. And there's nothing to do with Democrats versus Republicans.
No.
Right? George W., if John McCain had been president, it would have been Republican advisors too.
So,
and what I said is you cannot know the counterfactual reliably, which turns out to be the important point.
Now, the other side of that, the counterpoint, I'm on your side, but the counterpoint would be when you see two groups of economists claiming either that the stimulus needs to be twice as big or it needs to be zero, one possibility is that one of the groups is right and the other is just wrong. It is strange to me that people argue with such vehemence about the certainty of their position, given that there are intelligent people on the other side, credible people with similar credentials. And the reason I say that is because if it were the case that one side was obviously right, and it was a scientific question as opposed to an ideological and philosophical question, well, then they could just show them the evidence. But of course, there is no evidence that's decisive.
Yeah, that's right.
That's decisive. There's only cherry picking. Yeah. So it's easy for each side to cherry pick. And I think the fundamental question is on this topic is, do we make progress? Are we getting closer? Right. And my view is I don't see any sign we're making progress. And right. To me, it takes an immense amount of hubris to be confident about your position in this story. And
I think
one more point, because I want you to introduce this other concept, which I thought was so useful. You introduced the phrase high causal density. And there's few things that have more high causal density, meaning lots of simultaneous changes that affect behavior and actions and outcomes than an economy-wide, than the economy as a whole. And to then pretend that you can isolate the effect of one of those changes and ignore all the others. And you do this many times in the book, but I did it yesterday on my blog, inspired by you, which is, if you list the things that happened since 2008, since 2009 when the stimulus was passed, and you would list, just to start, it's easy to make a fairly long list to start with. You have an enormous change in monetary policy. You have enormous changes in housing prices. You have huge policy interventions in healthcare and in financial sector regulation. You have animal spirits, consumer confidence bouncing around, doing all kinds of unexpected and unknown things. You have international changes, and you don't pretend that you can quantify. Oh, you also have a recovery that starts at one point, in the output market at least. And so you're trying to measure the impact of one of those changes, the stimulus spending, on, say, employment. And you can't quantify 5 of the things I just mentioned. A couple of them you can.
Right. But
you're going to pretend that you've therefore isolated the impact of the one that you really want to care about? I mean, what kind of...
Right.
To me, it's so intellectually dishonest. I don't understand. And I'm an economist.
Right. Exactly. Right. So, I guess there are obviously, again, multiple great parts to this question. So when you say, you have these two groups arguing and there's the potential that, one's right and one's wrong and so on. One is right and one is wrong about what the effect of the stimulus was, direction at least. I just don't know which one.
Yep.
It's like two groups of people. It's like asking me the question, is the number of stars in our galaxy odd or even? Well, there's a real answer to that question. And if I had a bunch of people yelling odd and a bunch of people yelling even, one of those two groups is right. But unless one of them has access to knowledge that I don't think we have as a species right now, we don't know. We don't know which one is right. And that doesn't mean it is a theoretically, technically answerable question, how many stars are there in the galaxy. But we don't have the knowledge right now, and we don't have the capacity to get the knowledge right now. And that's the way I feel about that debate.
And if you did, if for example, we had a debate about on a baseball team on the defense, how many players are in the field? Is it odd or even? We know the answer is, I say it's 9, right, and 9 is odd. You say no, it's an even number, and we count them. And you would have to go, yeah, right. Oh, I guess I was wrong. There's nothing analogous to that, remotely analogous to that in the case of economic policy intervention.
I think that's certainly in the case of macroeconomics, right. So, I think this idea of causal density is an important one. And so in the book, I try and break apart this idea of generally, phenomenological complexity into components, one of which I call causal density. And if you think about using an experiment, which is the analog to your let's just count the number of people on the field example or metaphor, think about the classic, and probably it's not exactly how it happened, story of Galileo dropping unequally weighted cannonballs off the Leaning Tower of Pisa to determine whether or not Aristotle was correct in his theory that heavier objects should fall to the earth faster than lighter objects. And of course, famously, he falsified the theory because he dropped these, two unequally weighted balls and they hit the ground at the same time. And, imagine when he did that. If you think about even classical mechanics, various bodies are interacting with these balls as they drop, right? There are the cannonballs themselves, and there's the Earth. And we can model the rate of descent to an excellent engineering approximation as being only the gravitational interaction between each of the balls and the Earth. But of course, there are gravitational interactions between those balls and the sun and the moon and each of the planets and, every dust particle in the Crab Nebula. Right?
Wind resistance that isn't the same for each ball because the atmosphere is varied.
Right. And so that's right. Imagine if instead of gravity attenuating with distance by 1 over r squared, imagine gravity doesn't attenuate with distance. And so as these balls moved in relation to each of those particles all over the universe, they started swinging around in crazy directions and not moving basically very steadily and rapidly towards the Earth. What you'd see is instead of balls dropping, you'd see two balls moving around all over the place. And it would be extremely difficult, to measure the effects of any of these interactions such that you could falsify or confirm a theory. And that's really, I think, what goes on in the economy. And so whenever I hear not just economists, but social scientists, describe some very plausible idea about a causal relationship, when we execute some program or take some action, look, people care a lot about financial incentives. So when we change the following price, this behavior will change. Almost always, the causal vector they're describing is sensible, and almost certainly there's at least one human being in which exactly the little story they told is in fact a cause which creates an action for them. The problem is there are millions and millions of other causes, many of which are relevant, acting on people who are being subjected to the following program. So while it sounds in a narrative sense so compelling, and then I do some regression analysis and try and show that I've really held everything else constant and measured the isolated effect of this cause, sounds so compelling to us. In fact, it is always more complicated than our methods, non-experimental methods, can handle. And the argument in the book is we kid ourselves when we think we have isolated causal effects.
So let me play someone on the other side, of which I would say it's most economists who gladly use regression analysis without shame. They would say, look, of course we can't control everything. Just like in the case of the falling cannonballs, I'm not going to take account of the distance of the Earth from the sun that day and the fact that one of the balls is closer to the sun than the other. And so you're right. But those are small. Those effects are small. And what I've done in my analysis, my regression analysis, is I've isolated the significant, important factors. And, you're just, again, you're nitpicking. You're just being, technically you're right. Wind resistance matters. But when it comes to dropping the cannonballs, they land at the same time. I don't need to take into account wind resistance or the distance from the sun. And similarly, when I'm doing regression analysis and isolating the impact, which regression analysis being a multivariate technique for isolating multiple causal vectors, where I can then have isolate the individual impact of one holding the other's constant. When I'm doing that, it's close enough. It's close enough for practical purposes. What's your response to that?
Well, first of all, I've built thousands of regression models in my life, and they are not useless. They're useful for certain purposes. What I argue is that they are not capable of determining reliable, useful, and non-obvious effects of interventions. And I'll give you several pieces of evidence which are extended at much greater length in the book for why. First of all, when you take celebrated, as I try and do in the book, regression analyses, you can show over and over again that the same problems recur and are significant. And, in semi-technical terms, emitted variable bias is not a kind of nitpick. Emitted variable bias, when it comes to, human systems, is massive. And you can show over and over again this is true.
Explain what emitted variable bias is. What do you mean by that?
What I mean by that is if I have a regression equation which tries to predict some outcome y as a function of a set of variables, I want to predict what unemployment will be as a function of, the size of the employment, hypothetically, the size of the population, economic growth rate in a prior period, the education level of the population, and so on. And I say, I'm trying to use this to measure the effect of changing education levels on unemployment. And all the variables other than education, changes in education level, are meant to be controls or to hold constant these other effects we described. That if I neglected to include a variable in my model for, let's say, the amount of immigration into the society, that turns out to be causally important. That what happens is, by failing to include that, I modify or create instability in all the parameter estimates, including the estimate of the variable I care about. And therefore, if I've left out any significant variables from my equation, the estimate of the impact of the variable I care about is called into question. And my argument is that all regression models, including, I take one I built and rip it apart in detail and show how this is true, all models like this are subject to emitted variable bias because we can't get data on all the potential causes, that the number of the complexity of the phenomenon outweighs our ability to build terms, to build interaction terms, and so on, and they are always subject to significant emitted variable bias, such that we cannot rely on their results.
And the response, I think, of the typical economist, applied economist is, well, yeah, but I'm doing the best I can. That's the best we can do.
Sometimes the best you can isn't good enough. In other words, the relevant standard, if I'm being practical about, I want advice as a person making decisions about programs, whether to do the program or not, or how to do it, or so on, is this the best analysis compared to other analyses? Is this the best analysis? Does this analysis add value versus other analyses or expert judgment? And my argument is that part of my argument is that in many instances, the analysis doesn't clear the hurdle of practicality. It doesn't actually create useful information I don't already have in the absence of the analysis.
Yeah, I agree with you. And the reason I agree with you is that I have come to believe, this is really embarrassing, again, as a professional economist, but I've come to believe that there may be no examples, there may be zero cases of where a sophisticated multivariate econometric analysis, which is what we're talking about, multivariate regression, in a high causal density case where important policy issues are at stake, has led to a consensus where somebody says, well, I guess I was wrong. People on the other side of the issue. Your analysis, you've got a significant coefficient there. I'm wrong. No, they always say, you left this out, you left that out. And they're right, of course. And then they can redo the analysis and show that, in fact, and so what that means is that the tools, instead of leading to certainty and improved knowledge about the usefulness of policy interventions, are merely window dressing for ideological biases that are pre-existing in the case of the researchers, which is a very harsh statement, and I'm not going to try to defend it here, but I want you to use as the example used in the book, which I thought was fantastic, of the physicist and the historian and later the economist advising the president, which to me highlights the gradations of science. I almost said degradations. The gradations of science that are present in how much we know and what we don't know.
Right. Well, I mean, I think that it's very difficult to prove a negative, right? So is there no example of that ever happening is a very tough statement to defend. However, one of the things I point out in the book is Greg Menke is a very eminent economist who's written, if not one of the most widely used economics textbooks in America, has a chapter, in his economics textbook where he says, okay, is economics a science or not? And he lists, in the edition I used in my book, it was 14. I think it's now expanded to 20 or so propositions to which economists agree. And, my reaction to that, when I go through that list, is kind of, where's the beef, right? Yeah. So I take these 14, assertions, and first of all, 7 of them are completely non-falsifiable value judgments. I'm quoting from memory, so this won't be exactly right. A country should not impose tariffs. So as soon as you see the word, should or would, et cetera, you're not really you're dealing with a normative statement, not a predictive rule. Right? Yeah. So how do you possibly test that? Even those which are theoretically falsifiable, in practice aren't, because the statement will be so general, like stimulative spending in an economy of the following conditions will create some gain in employment. And I suspect, but don't know, that many of the people who oppose the stimulus program, for example, would agree that, look, I can't measure it, but I think it's, as a practical matter, very likely that U.S. GDP was at least $1 higher in one quarter because we spent, $820 billion, to use your number. But the point is, I need to have a parameter estimate that allows me to say, is this a good use of investment of resources or not? And at that point, you don't have alignment. And by the way, all of these 14 statements are generally agreed to by between 75 and 90%
it's not 100.
of economists.
It's not 100.
Yeah. Well, basically, I bet I could find a physicist somewhere who's a tenured professor of physics somewhere on Earth who would disagree that Newton's laws of motion provide, an excellent engineering approximation for motion of bodies at non-relativistic speeds and above quantum size. But I could probably find like one.
You can't find 20%
like 99.99% agree. So I think there's good evidence that even if you have to clear the hurdle of, I've got agreement among economists, then you have to clear the hurdle of, it's agreement and they're right. You don't even clear the hurdle of agreement, I think. And, I don't think that's because they're dumb or not working hard. I think that's because they're studying a very complicated phenomenon. And the example that you cite, or the little kind of parable almost that I open that section of the book with, is basically saying, look, imagine you're the president of the United States and you are receiving, you're considering an Iranian nuclear weapons program and what to do about it. And into the room walks your science advisor and she says, look, if the Iranians take the following amount of fissile material and combine it in a sphere of this size and this method, it will create an explosion big enough to blow up the city. And next into the room comes a historian. And the historian says, well, if we attempt to subvert the Iranian nuclear weapons program, my reading of the history of Iran is that the people will want this enough. They will continue to replace one way or another the government until this happens. So it really is not a good idea to try and stop this. And what I say is, even if it happens to be President Carter, who was trained as a nuclear engineer, even if you know nuclear physics, for the president to sit there and begin debating the empirically validated laws of physics with a science advisor is kind of foolish. On the other hand, not debating with a historian, not bringing in different historians with different points of view, talking to people who've lived in Iran, personal introspection about human motivations would be equally foolish. And so really, you ought to treat the prediction made by the physicist very differently than the prediction made by the historian. Both are valuable. I would never advise taking an action without listening to both those people, and lots of historians in the case of the historian and non-historian experts, non-historians who know about the situation. And then imagine third, the president's economic advisor walks in the room and she says, well, the CIA has a program to counterfeit currency in Iran. And the idea is this amount of counterfeiting will create this amount of inflation and in turn this amount of unemployment. The question I pose is, should you as the president treat the economist's prediction more like the historian's prediction or more like the physicist's prediction? And what I say is a lot more like the historian's prediction.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I've come to believe one of the things I really liked about your book was how much it parallels my thinking. So I have to be careful being subject to my own confirmation bias. But in recent months, I used to say economics isn't like physics, it's more like biology. But I'm starting to really think it's more like history in the cases that we care about and the applications that we care about. And I want to say, by the way, for all those listening, that of course I think understanding economics and understanding trade-offs and understanding emergent order, the parts of economics that I think are glorious and important are very useful in helping you organize your thinking and understand the world. What I think it's not good at is predicting the impact of government spending on employment, say. And it's ironic, though, that you picked for your example one of the few areas where I think we do know a little bit, not a lot, but a little bit. So when I talk about empirical work that has changed people's minds in the profession, Friedman and Schwartz, their Monetary History of the United States, which I think came out in 1960, actually, I think did have an impact on how economists of differing ideologies and methodological views came to see the impact of the money supply on inflation. Now, I don't think we can quantify it. We can't quantify the impact on unemployment, but I'd be pretty confident that if the U.S. government increased the money supply of Iran through counterfeit money that was accepted, that it would raise the price level and maybe continuously if we continued to do it in Iran. But that's about it for me. There are many other economy-wide experiments I'm comfortable with. And I say that the little certainty that I do have because I think there have been a lot of natural experiments where not much else changed except the money supply. And we know a little bit about that. Those are not multivariate regression analyses. They're not complicated econometric analyses. They're simply, the Civil War, during the Civil War, the Union overran the South's printing press and inflation stopped in the South. Those kind of observations make me pretty confident about there's a relationship there. I can't quantify it precisely, but I think I know the direction. But just
well, I think that a couple things are true. One is I very much avoided getting into any kind of a debate really about the semantics of is economics a science or is social science really science and so on. One of the things I try to emphasize is just a way. Science is just a way of trying to make progress, and the real question is how much progress does this method achieve in different areas. And I think that when it comes to the adjudication of the actual questions of political economy that confront the government of the United States or other highly developed economies, it is very difficult to find examples of, here's this prediction for the effect of this proposed interaction, which is non-obvious and which is reliable, that allows us to make a different decision that we know is better. I'm not saying it never happens, but it's actually quite rare. And further,
Go ahead.
And further, I think that the way forward, and it will only lead to marginal improvements, but the way forward is to use lots more experiments, natural where you have them, but controlled where you can possibly do them. And that, to go all the way back to the beginning of our conversation, this was one of the insights of Francis Bacon. When you take the view about science that its ultimate purpose is to help us master our environment, there's a reason the method he put forward, which he named in Latin, but was very quickly named the experimental method and later the scientific method, focused on experiments because they're a feedback loop which allows us to end certain kinds of debates and make progress.
So let's talk about one experiment that you mentioned in the book, which these kind of experiments in social science drive me crazy. And recent guests, I've talked about these kind of issues in the social sciences, but there's a famous experiment where shoppers were confronted with a small amount of choice, in this case of jam, and then a large amount of choice, and an unintuitive thing happened. The large number of choices discouraged purchase, and this, of course, encouraged some people to conclude that choice is dangerous or not as good as we thought, or people aren't rational. Talk about that experiment and why it's just slightly maybe exaggerated in terms of what we learned from it.
Yeah, of course. So in my company that I started, basically what we do is we provide software used to design and interpret experiments disproportionately in retail. So I have seen the results of and designed thousands and thousands of retail experiments. And so I'm very familiar with the kind of experiment that was described in this paper about the jam experiment. And what happened is, in that experiment, a group of researchers set up a table in a particular grocery store in Northern California on 2 successive Saturdays. And for 5 hours total across these 2 Saturdays, they had a table set up which said, try our jams, and if you like them, you get $1 off if you go and buy the jams over there on the counter where you purchase jams. And for 5 of the hours, they had a small selection of jams, 6 or 8, and for 5 of the hours, they had 24, I think, types of jam on the table. And what they observed is that the redemption rate on the coupon, the percentage of people who showed up and looked at the table who ultimately bought a jar of jam, was greater during the hours where they had a smaller selection of jams than a larger selection of jams. So that's the experiment. Now, this has been telescoped up into statements about
capitalism works or
how
doesn't.
humans how humans respond to choice and choice overload. And Barry Schwartz wrote a best-selling book about this. And there are a few observations I make about this experiment. First of all, the difference in the conversion rates is incredible. There's one is 10 times the other. In other words,
what do you mean by conversion rates?
So the percentage of people who bought the jam divided by the number of people who bought the jam divided by the number of people who visited the table was in one case about 30% in the small selection case, and it was about 3% in the large selection case. So first of all, if you were to believe this experiment would apply at the level of generality to be relevant for, social reality, social programs, what that's saying is basically by eliminating 75% of my products, of my SKUs in a store, I could, increase sales by 10x. That's a pretty gigantic belief about a kind of market abnormality.
That's a lot of $20 bills laying on the ground.
It's suitcases of cash,
yeah.
Right? I mean, I've worked with a lot of the biggest retailers in the world, and believe me, they are constantly trying to squeeze out little margins. The idea that I could take a supermarket, cut out 75% of the products, and my sales would go up by a factor of 10 is implausible, to say the least. So I've also, across these many thousands experiments, there's a reason why if you were to run experimenting, probably at least 1,000, maybe thousands of those thousands have been experiments about promotional actions like this. You normally don't run a test like this in one store over 2 days. You run it over maybe several weeks across 20 or 30 stores. And the reason is because you have all kinds of violations of the assumption of independent, identically distributed observations when you cluster things in one store over a few hours. And what you really want to know is, okay, do I have a repeatable finding here that can be generalized to other instances? And actually, academics, since that time, it was a little over 10 years ago that paper was done, there have been 50 attempts to go out and do this, replicate a version of this experiment in various other contexts, MP3 players and, electronics in the store and so on. And when you look at the distribution of results of what appears to be the effect in the test group, the low choice group versus the high choice group, what you see, first of all, is a big normal looking distribution. That's when you measure the effect on revenue of, or sales or consumption of higher versus lower choice is centered on, but not surprisingly, when you reduce choice, you actually reduce consumption. When you increase choice, you increase consumption. And so what it's highlighting, I think, is why sequences of replicated experiments are crucial. Arnold Kling had a better way of putting it than I did when he read an early version of something I wrote, which is don't trust one-offs. Even when you do experiments, first of all, you have to design the experiment right. And I think this experiment was, they're very careful researchers, and I see why they did what they did, and it was smart the way they designed it, but fundamentally they just didn't have the resources to run the experiment right, to run it across multiple sites at enough time, which is an important lesson for social experiment. But second, even if you had good internal validity in the experiment, you had a well-designed experiment, the effect of interventions varies so much with context because of this idea of causal density that you need replications of experiments to begin to have confidence that you have a generalizable finding that could be applied to future instances.
And of course, there's a publication bias. The studies that survive are the ones that find a big impact, especially a counterintuitive impact. And that's definitely the case, but it's really, I talk about this in the book. So there's this famous paper focused on medical findings from 2005, and it's one of the most widely cited papers in medicine now. The guy did is he went back and said, okay, I'm going to look at instances where some finding has been reported, and then it's been attempted to be replicated with the same or stronger research design. So if it was a kind of epidemiological study and found the effect, I'm making this example up, of aspirin on, heart attacks, it's the following. Has there been after that a true randomized trial, say, of the effect of aspirin on heart attacks, or if it was an originally randomized controlled trial of aspirin, was there another randomized controlled trial in the exact same intervention, and so on? And said, what happens when you look at replications? And the headline finding is, on the order of something like half the findings either fail on replication or they have a materially smaller effect on replication. But below the headline finding is that actually 90% of the time when the first finding is a randomized trial, it's replicated correctly. 20% of the time when the first finding is not a randomized trial, it fails replication. This is a good example of what we were talking about earlier, which is why should we not believe that we can really use regression and other methods to find causality? Because in this example,
when put to the test, it doesn't work. However, when you really run randomized trials right, there's a reason we do it. Like in medicine, it will generally be replicated. And in spite of all the publication bias stuff, in spite of all the incentives that are really skewed about pharma companies and so on, when you really run randomized trials in medicine, you do see good replication of results. It is a reliable finding. When we move kind of up the ladder of complexity, social reality for things like the jam choice experiment, what happens is replication is not certain, because the effect of polio vaccine in the bloodstream. I can run a polio vaccine test in Norfolk, Virginia, and be reasonably comfortable that if I've run that test right and I found that it prevents polio, it's going to work in suburban Seattle and downtown Dallas and rural Ohio. If I do a literacy program in Norfolk, Virginia, I cannot conclude that finding is applicable in all those different environments. The reason is because generalization is much harder in a more complicated social environment than for biological interventions, where we can usually make a tolerable engineering assumption about uniform biological response.
Yeah, you mentioned you go through a number of different social areas where we've tried large-scale and small-scale experiments. One you mentioned in education is the STAR experiment, which I think was done in Tennessee, right. And right. Which purported to show that smaller class sizes led to better test results, if I remember correctly, one of the claims. But of course,
that's right.
It's not just that, well, maybe it works in Tennessee, but it won't work in Texas or North Dakota. It's that you didn't necessarily control for how it was administered and who followed the actual rules of the control group and who volunteered to be the control group. So it's not really a randomized field trial the way it would be if you administer the polio vaccine. It's in a way a mix of a randomized field trial with a regression analysis ultimately.
Well, I think that, that experiment was a well-designed experiment that really was randomized and so on. I think that it's actually a lot of the choice natural experiments where you do have this the kind of the bacillus of regression analysis and so on, and matching is introduced. I think the problem with the STAR experiment is not internal validity, but it's external validity, which is to say, what exactly as you're saying, in different contexts, both defined by different kinds of school districts or different kinds of economic environments, and also, as you're saying, different levels of execution, skill, and so on, it is unclear how generalizable that finding is because it was one experiment. And it's very dangerous to rely on a single experiment. I go through an example of this where you had a single experiment, it was relied upon, and while the program was being rolled out, actually replications were happening, which completely undermined the initial political conclusion. That was the case of a famous crime experiment. And so what I'd say is, I read all of my reading about that experiment, which I've read a lot about, is it was a well-designed, professionally executed experiment. It was only done once in one place.
So what are we to conclude? In the book, you suggest we need a lot more trial and error, which we need a lot more laboratories working. We need a lot more multiple interventions that are experimental in nature that allow us to learn something. Because one of the things that you could conclude from your book really is the how little we know, obviously, and
right.
How do we improve on that? Is it by the way, the other lesson, which I think is really very powerful, and there's more than one, but one of the more powerful lessons of the book is that even things that work don't have much of an impact, and you'd expect that. There are no silver magic bullets laying around that we haven't fired in these social contexts often, and that's comes back to the point that economics is about trade-offs. There's no magic policy that's going to make everybody twice as smart or even 20% smarter. Most of them are going to have small marginal impacts, and that's hard for people to accept politically.
Yeah, I agree. And I've seen this over and over again as huge companies implement this. And what I observe is what you see in large corporations and all the experiments I've seen around business experiments, you see the exact same thing, field after field after field in social science, economics, education, social welfare, criminology, and I kind of document this, field by field, that there are some observations you can have about, well, what happens when you put these great-sounding reform or improvement programs to the test? And first of all, almost nothing works at all. So a vast majority of ideas cannot survive multiple replicated randomized experiments and demonstrate improvement in a test group versus a control group. Like the vast majority do nothing. Second, to your point, of those that work almost always create very small improvements. Progress is a mountain of pebbles, not, if we could just get nurse visitation and Head Start to young kids, we would solve, a vast part of the problem of inequality and poor education results for lots of people. Not true. Even the things that work create small improvements. And third, trying to change people and their character is even less likely to succeed than trying to change incentives that people face or the environment they operate in. Those are some meta lessons, I think, about that you can see by looking at experiments. And I don't believe before this book, I don't know if anyone's tried to do this, which is really look across. I tried to catalog every large-scale randomized field experiment ever done in the developed world. And I don't succeed because I don't know for a fact I got every one of them, but I think I have most of them. And it's striking how consistent those findings are across different areas and are consistent with what I see in business experiments.
Now, in the area of international aid and fighting poverty outside the United States, there's been a recent growth in field trials in underdeveloped poor countries trying to test the effects of interventions. And one of the leaders in that field, Banerjee, was a guest on this program and defended that strategy. Thinking about that work now in light of your book, it seems to me that literature is very weak on replication. They're very big on one-time experiments that have often very large impacts. I don't think they've gone back and looked at multiple interventions in multiple places, but maybe they have. Do you know that literature at all?
Not well. I mean, I'm aware of it, obviously, and I referenced it in the book, but one of the reasons I was careful to qualify in the developed world when I talked about listing experiments was I don't believe that I know enough about the context of I've lived a good part of my life outside the United States, but don't know the context of those societies well enough to really interpret them. In general, there is rapid growth on a percent basis, of experiments in social science. So I don't believe I'm a voice crying in the wilderness. I think I'm aligned with a reform movement. It still is an extreme minority opinion, or extreme minority sort of predilection. But in field after field, you see it growing. And one hotspot for sure is the Poverty Action Lab and what they're doing in terms of international experiments. I have observed informally the same thing you have, which is I don't see a lot of replication, and therefore external validity is an open question. And it's possible that you can get much bigger gains in the developing world potentially than you can in the developed world, because in some rough conceptual sense we're closer to the efficient frontier. But I start from a position of skepticism that these relatively simple interventions can really create gigantic improvements. It doesn't mean I know that it's not true, or even that I disbelieve it. Really, that I'd want to see independent replication before I'd accept the finding.
Another theme in the book, it's a very Hayekian book overall, and this is a particularly Hayekian idea, is that often what we observe around us is a very dense ecosystem of responses to the environment. And to think that by changing one thing you could lead to some outcome that your model has predicted is naive at best, dangerous at worst. And you suggest in the book that creates a status quo bias that you suggest is not a pejorative term, that we should be much more trusting of how the world has emerged and less optimistic about our ability to tweak it or steer it. And I agree with you, but does that not also imply that I should be uneasy about rolling back interventions that I think have failed? So, for example, I would love to get rid of the public school system. I think government schools don't do a very good job. Yet I also realize that there's a whole set of things that have sprung up and in response to that. And are you comfortable suggesting that moving towards, say, more school choice or more private privatization, which I think you're sympathetic to, that's an unambiguous policy improvement.
Right. So, I mean, I think that what I call rational status quo preference does not imply we should not seek improvement and reform, and that we should be, I believe that we should be eternally dissatisfied with the status quo, but humble about our ability to know how to improve. And I think it does imply, as you say, that we should be humble about rolling back features of our political economy that are not brand new and have become part of the landscape that people use to manage their lives. Edmund Burke has this great quote about this in Reflections on the Revolution in France, where he talks about the revolutionaries changing the town names and the units of measure and so on, and basically saying they're unable to use the vehicles available to them to reform and improve their society organically. And his great quote is that they should give up the tools because they don't know their trade as politicians. And one of the reasons I argue in the book at length that I do believe there's evidence that there are at least some marginal improvements created by increases in school choice. What I argue probably will satisfy neither side of that debate, but that moving in that direction of greater choice does make sense, but that we need to take it one step at a time, because we don't live at year zero of the revolution. We live in a world with existing institutions, and we ought to be more cautious than bold about radical changes to those institutions.
And what was the nice way you described it? Not status quo bias. How'd you describe it?
A rational status quo preference.
A rational status quo preference. So I like that.
It's a more accurate way to describe what people call status quo bias, because obviously they're trying to load the dice on the language.
Yeah. So given that that's I think correct, having a rational status quo preference, not a bad starting place. You suggest in the book some ways that we might improve on the status quo by gaining something close to knowledge as opposed to what we often pretend to have. One of the things you advocate is more state experimentation. So what make the case for that?
Well, I think that I'll start with an actual historical, it's aligned with my argument, I guess, an actual historical experience that I think is an imperfect prototype for what I'm describing. So in the 1960s and the 1980s, as welfare, or was time called AFDC, became a huge political issue and was losing a lot of its legitimacy as a program that was supporting a way of life that lots of people who are paying taxes didn't agree with. There was huge political impetus to reform it. And from the late 80s to the early 90s, there were a wave of experiments done in the United States. And the basis of the experiments were states administer welfare in the United States. And the government, the federal government, has a long list of rules for how you have to go about executing this program. And states began to request and get waivers, what are called policy waivers. So state X said, it's not the current law, but we would like to institute a family cap, which is after a certain number of kids in your family, your per person benefit begins to decline. And what the federal government did is said, okay, we'll start to become very liberal about giving these waivers. But the quid pro quo is you must run a randomized experiment if you want the waiver, in which some people randomly chosen get the change and some randomly chosen people don't. And this experiment has to be run according to defined protocols, and you have to report the results. And there were 31 of these experiments run in that era, and we discovered real knowledge that led to the replacement of the AFDC program, among many other political considerations, with a program called TAMP, which is now what we mean by welfare and is oriented around getting people from welfare to work, and has been, in my view, an unambiguous, huge policy success. And so what I argue is that whatever on any given area of our political economy, from healthcare to welfare to unemployment insurance to criminology, whatever, to whatever extent we feel the need to have uniform national rules at some level or higher or lower level of abstraction or specificity, and I argue that in general we should be heavily biased towards allowing independent localities to be free to do what they want. Wherever we are in that trade-off in any given area, we should have a very strong predilection, which is not absolute, but within very broad limits, to allow states that say, look, we want to try some variant of this law, to allow them to do it, to give them a policy waiver, but make as a quid pro quo an experiment, so we can actually measure the results of that change. I think that is not the road to nirvana, but is the road to lots of small incremental improvements in our national regulations. And increasingly, we will discover that, what works in Alabama on this topic doesn't work in Alaska, and, letting Alabama and Alaska do different things.
And we're almost out of time. Do you have any suggestions for how we might improve macroeconomics as it's practiced? I mean, one of the things your book does, I think, that's very healthy, is I think it sensitizes the reader to the dangers of the phrase "studies show," and I don't think that you can have enough books that remind people that that's not a scientific statement, even though they're peer-reviewed, even though it made the front page of the New York Times. And as we're talking, I'm thinking about Hayek's Pretense of Knowledge Nobel Prize address, which is another version of what we're talking about. Can you imagine anything that would help us make progress in the area of macro, or should honest people just say it's beyond our skills as human beings?
It's beyond my skills. I don't know about other people's, because I think at a practical level, I can't imagine, which doesn't mean it can't be done, I just can't imagine how you would run real experiments to test theories. And therefore, in terms of what I know about, it would be very hard for me to describe ways to make progress. And therefore, my argument would be we ought to think of, basically the precept ought to be very humble about what we think we know and don't know about macroeconomics, and therefore, as a corollary, always hedge our bets. And, if absent of progress made by people other than me, that's the way I would see it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm one of my favorites is the view that we just haven't had enough depressions. We've had, 1.5 maybe, and we just need 20 when we have 20 or 30 more, we'll have enough. And in our in the Keynes Hayek rap video that I did with John Popola. Keynes talks about World War II ending the Great Depression, which is very widely believed, I think, by many people. And we have Hayek respond, one data point, you're jumping for joy. The last time I looked, wars only destroy. And I think there's so much cherry picking and data point conclusions that are drawn. It's hard to imagine that we'll accumulate enough experience to learn more.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Keynes Hayek rap videos are among the great artifacts of Western civilization.
You're very kind.
But I think we could have 20,000 Great Depressions, and it still wouldn't resolve the problem, because I can think of lots of instances where we have 20,000 or 20 million occurrences of some phenomenon, and we still can't identify the causal mechanism correctly.
My guest today has been Jim Manzi. Jim, thanks for being part of EconTalk.
Thanks for having me.
This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.